Many times, students have said to me things like, that they seem to be worried about your example in this regard. They say, there seems to be an awful lot of despair. And what I have found myself saying to them is that I see that despair cast in humor.
Well, I think you're right, but here again, I think too much is made of despair in my case. I mean, I don't experience all that much despair in my life, and I think that, at least in my poems, we may be overreading. I mean, I think life is wonderful. If I'm unhappy about it, it's that it has to end in such grotesque ways so often, and that we're made to feel while we're alive so lonely and so small and so diminished in an increasingly large universe for which there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. And I don't think it's not pure despair, it's not frustration, it's not anger, it's a sense that there is no ultimate answer, and we have to satisfy ourselves with provisional reasons for being. And I think if you think a lot, that becomes not only tiresome but frustrating. I mean, this is a partial answer because I haven't had enough wine. But I'm not likely to at this hour.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how we've done this because I had a completely different idea as to how we were going to get to these questions, and I imagined all this happening toward the end of the interview. But maybe it's best to get to it at the beginning. Sometimes I think of you as the poet of death.
Well, death is interesting. I mean, you've got to admit that we don't know anything about it until it's too late. And we can only imagine what it's like. Or we can witness others dying, which is a very unappetizing prospect. We usually turn the other way. But death is an inevitability, and the older you get, the less horrifying it seems. What's horrifying as you get older is a debilitating illness, an extended illness that will drain everyone else's time and energy and make everyone else unhappy for days and days, months and months, and even years and years, and one wants to spare others that. And also to spare oneself the humiliation of being dependent on others. That's what's horrifying. Death itself is, I mean, I think of life as a kind of party, and death is sort of having to go home, or having to say goodbye, and knowing that the party's going to go on without you. No one likes to feel that he or she is indispensable, but the party does go on without you. And you go into a state which is pretty much the state you were in before you were born, which is a kind of nothingness. I mean,
explain that we live between
two great darks. The first with an ending, luckily for us. The second without one, unhappily for us.
There seems to me to be a bridge between, let us say, the selected and the continuous life. And the bridge I saw was in a piece that I just like to read to you. And I would like you, if you would, just a role play for a little bit, and to pretend like you didn't write this.
Sure.
Would that
Maybe I didn't. I'm already getting into the role.
A morning. I have carried it with me each day. That morning I took my uncle's boat from the brown water cove and headed for Mosher Island. Small waves splashed against the hull, and the hollow creak of oarlock and oar rose into the woods of black pine crusted with lichen. I moved like a dark star, drifting over the drowned other half of the world, until, by a distant prompting, I looked over the gunwale and saw beneath the surface a luminous room, a light-filled grave, saw for the first time the one clear place given to us when we are alone.
Who did you say wrote that?
I say it's a gift from wherever those things come from.
You know, it's. I am rather fond of that poem. It's hard for me to sort of think of it as someone else's, because it deals with a very specific experience, and
it's one of the reasons why I chose
one close to revelation. Well, in the poem it is couched in the terms of revelation. When I was a boy, we used to stay at my aunt's house in Glen Margaret, Nova Scotia. First we stayed in French Village, then Seabright, and then Glen Margaret. I was allowed, because I was a big kid and could swim. I was allowed to go out in a boat by myself, and I often would go out this day I wanted to go to Mosher Island, which is about a mile away, and I'd never been there before, and I started rowing. It was a calm day, and I experienced a kind of eeriness, uneasiness in the boat, and I looked down over the gunwale, and I saw a bottom a good ways from shore. I was sort of in the middle, and it was so surprising. At first it was like seeing a vision in the sky. I mean, it was like something that shouldn't have been there. I mean, I knew that the bottom of the sea sometimes rises and there are shallower spots, but to see far from any land the bottom struck me as very peculiar, and that's the origin of that poem.
For me to have thought of it as a bridge seems interesting to me now, especially having said that, because the land seems to be, rising in this little jaunt that you took, the land form beneath the sea.
Yeah.
It's amazing how things like that happen. How the subconscious works.
Well, it has some of the cadence of the continuous life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that the poems toward the end are more autobiographical than the ones in the end of the selected poems.
Yeah.
More autobiographical than the ones in the continuous life, but the lines get longer, and I think that they have the suggestion of the cadence of the continuous life.
Mm-hmm. Well, another thing that just strikes me really hard is, this idea of the light-filled grave, and it seems to me that there has been this amazing transformation that's taken place in you personally.
Uh-huh.
I see it in not only in your work, but in the way you have dealt with folks like me. I speak as in the role of an interviewer now. I can remember in an anthology, for example, you responded to a question about your work. You just simply said, "I just don't have anything to say." This was, let us say, in the early 70s. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me you were much more reticent to talk about your work, which is a manifestation of another thing. It seems to me that there's an openness to existence that there was not 20 years ago. And I think there's a lot of other things going on, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Well, as one gets older, one realizes one has less to hide, that one isn't quite as special, one needn't be as private as one thought. My reticence early on was that I didn't want to misrepresent the poems, about which I wasn't all that sure. It's not that I'm sure of my poems now, but I'm sort of existentially sure, and I'm much more at ease in my role as a poet. I mean, I can't deny that the poems are mine, and sometimes I do realize that some of them pose problems or are difficult, and I do my best to clarify the issue of the poem. I think I was just protecting myself in those days. And also, I could have been lazy too, and just, once you've written a poem, it's so exhausting. You don't want to go back over it. And very often, when you've written the poem, you don't really know what you've done. And you don't have a reading for all of your poems. For example, the light-filled grave that I saw just struck me as rather beautiful, and to take sort of the darkest place we will ever be and fill it with light struck me as a sort of luminous notion and transporting notion, and actually almost hopeful.
Yes.
And attractive, and mesmerizing, and so that the horror of death is alleviated a little by the fact that it is a light-filled grave. We don't go into a dark place.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me that that's what the continuous life is all about. There is a huge understanding, it seems to me, that occurred someplace along the line, from the late hour to the continuous life. By the way, you did tell me in Washington, did you not, that Always was the first of the...
earliest poem in the continuous life, yeah.
Yes, it was the first one you wrote.
That, and I wrote the King, which is one of the grotesques. Those are the earliest, right. And the last one was called The End. I wrote. But without sort of telling everybody too much about myself, there were periods in my life when I wasn't exactly happy, and I think my move to Utah was a good one for me psychologically, and although the first couple of years there it was difficult, I had a difficult time adjusting, and I think toward the end of Selected Poems I disbelieved in myself as a poet, and I stopped writing. I just didn't want to write any more autobiographical poems or poems where I was the center of something that was happening in my life, and I'd sort of lost belief in the persuasive powers of the imagination and the beauty of being able to make something up from scratch, however remote. And I stopped, and I turned to journalism and short stories and kids' books, and I did all this other stuff just to keep busy. But it was 5 years, a hiatus of 5 years, where I didn't write poems, and I was quite miserable. And then in 1985, everything turned around. I was happy. I had it was actually a little before I started writing it. I had a son, a young son. It made me very happy, and the birth of my son was very rejuvenating, and I really didn't care very much about my career as a poet, and I started writing again. I was sort of outside, in some ways, outside of myself, and took myself a little less seriously. I'd come to Utah with a lot of, others had expectations. I was the poet, and then when I got there, I didn't write. I wasn't writing poetry, so I felt a little sheepish about that. And I was forced to teach poetry because, after all, that's what I'd been. And I found it difficult to teach it and not do it. These are all personal matters. I don't know, but I think my life. This is not a sad story, but even in your 50s, early 50s, your life can turn around. And it's been pretty nice.
And your son did an awful lot of that, huh?
Well, yes. I adore him. Yes.
Yeah. Did you have an opportunity to? Did you think as your son was, let us say, 2, 3, 4 years old? He's 8 now, right?
Almost 8.
Did you have the feeling of being able to relive your childhood to some degree, or?
Well, no, I saw my own childhood. I mean, actually, the painful parts of it in my son's own growing up. Mm-hmm. And he's a much different child than I was, with, in a different environment. And my childhood was rather peculiar because I came to this country not knowing English at the age of 4.5 and was put into kindergarten right away and was persecuted mercilessly. And because of first my lack of English and then my French accent. And my son is very garrulous and very talkative and very bright, and I was very reticent, made reticent by my inability to speak English. My son, on the other hand, would stop people in the supermarket and say, "Hello, my name is Tom Strand, and this is my friend Jules." That's my wife. And the women would say, "Well, you're a little angel," and he would say, "I'm a little poet." I mean, this sort of thing, rather precocious and on the verge of a kind of brattiness, but not quite. But I never said anything. So it's not that
Can I take you up to adolescence quickly?
Yeah.
Were you a good student?
No. Mm-mm.
Why not?
Because I daydreamed all the time. I never concentrated. I would lock myself up in my room and paint self-portraits. I was madly in love with myself. I mean, I was both very self-conscious and very madly egotistical, and very self-doubting at the same time. A mixture of things. But I had a great deal of competency in sports. This is one thing I have that my son doesn't have. He's not a very good athlete, so he's more bookish. And I was not bookish at all. I was rather artistic and dreamy, or else out practicing basketball or football until I broke bones.
Yeah. By the way, your dog's name is Malone, and it's
Karl Malone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not Beckett's Malone.
Mm-hmm. I wonder, does that have anything to do with the fact that his nickname is the Mailman as well?
No, he delivers.
Yeah. Well, no. I'm thinking about the piece.
No, it doesn't. I never would thought of my own poem.
Mm-hmm.
No.
Say, what elements of poetry are there in basketball?
Well, I think basketball is actually my favorite. Basketball and soccer are my two favorite games, but the styles of the game, Brazilian soccer and basketball, the way the Chicago Bulls play it, is where the more emphasis is on transition, and it's more improvisational and more balletic instead of a simple. I mean, the Utah Jazz play a rather stodgy post-up game with Karl Malone getting the ball from John Stockton and muscling his way in some fashion to the basket. That's rather dull. But I think it's
maybe they need
basketball.
Orrin Hatch on the team.
I don't know. I doubt it. But it's improvisational, and it's fluid, and It's not like baseball where you have to wait for somebody, the pitcher, to pitch the ball, the batter hits the ball. I mean, no matter what Barchamati says about baseball, it just doesn't have the flow of a game of basketball. And basketball can change very rapidly. I mean, you can have these turnabouts that happen almost without your noticing it instantaneously. You can feel a team flag, and you feel the unity of a team in basketball or soccer more than you do in baseball or football.
You know,
And also there are fewer guys to keep track of.
I've often said to my students that when we're talking about composition, or we're talking about poetry writing too, it seems to me that the great poem is like the great basketball game. That it's got to start out strong, and there's a lot of energy in the arena, and then things begin to trail off, and then of course in a great basketball game, this thing just ends in a frenzy. It seems to me. I see that. I see that happening all the time with all kinds of sports, of course, but with basketball, it seems to me to be more intense.
Well, if it's a close game.
Yes, but of course there are those bad poems too. That.
Well, not all good poems are close. I mean, do you think? I mean, like it almost never. I guess the close poem would be, this is a poem that almost never happened. It's just fortunate that I was here and saw that thing that sparked something in my head. You're right. I mean, there is. I think before you write, I don't know, I can't evaluate poems that way, but I think that there is an urgency or a need to sit down and say something. You don't know what you're going to say, and you have no idea what the poem is going to be, but there's a certain excitement, and you anticipate the beginning of something. It's almost the best part of writing.
Would you tell the audience about what you found inside your copy of the selected?
Well, I found, you have it now, you know what I found a little piece of paper in which I'd scribbled 4 lines. I had forgotten about it. And I have several copies of selected poems at home. I just grab one and go out when I go give a reading. And I guess this is one I hadn't grabbed in a while, the one I brought here, and I had a piece of paper with 4 lines in it. I looked at them. I didn't think they were very good, although they had a certain peculiar quality. But Karl liked them. So.
Well, earlier you said, and by the way, I was really taken when you said, I will give you this and it won't exist, but you'll own it, And I asked you, well, can I print it? And I went home last night saying to myself, what a foolish thing to say, because after all, the idea of the gift is something that has to be preserved, and I don't.
Well, you can print it as long as you explain that I never finished this. I didn't intend it for publication.
Yes.
I wrote it, and I gave it to you.
But part of the beauty of the piece has become the fact that you just gave it, and you said it doesn't exist, but you have it.
Exists outside of my work for you.
Yes.
Not in my work.
Yes. But earlier you said, one cannot deny. So the implication, one cannot deny one's own work. So the implication here is that only after one has seriously considered the piece or seriously spent time with the piece does it become one's own. Am I coming to a reasonable conclusion here?
Yeah. Well, in other words, it's half true. I wrote the poem that I'm most identified with is an early poem called "Keeping Things Whole," which I spent 20 seconds writing, and I've never felt it was my poem because I didn't work on it long enough.
By the way, what kind of game were you playing? Were you playing
cribbage.
poker?
Cribbage, yeah.
With one person, or?
Yeah, just two-handed cribbage.
Did the person know that you were?
Yeah, it was Don Justice, another poet. I said, "Excuse me, Don, I want to write something down." So, but that's a case of a poem that's I'm very identified with, but I don't feel close to. On the other hand, there are poems that I've spent years on that I feel very attached to that I'm not identified with. That have a very sort of minor place in my work. But I mean, to have an existence means to be in. I mean, when I talk about existence, I mean to be in one of the books that has my name on it.
Okay.
So it's part of that. I mean, I have two identities: an identity that exists between the covers of books, and then I have my identity that the one that eats breakfast and lunch and dinner, that loves my son and wife, and that's follows basketball. I choose to live in the life of breakfast, lunch, and dinner and family, a domestic world. I don't live in the world of my books. I can't participate in my career because I think it's boring and it's destructive.
In what regard?
Well, because you can never fulfill the expectations of others. I mean, they have a very abstract or enlarged notion of you, and your career is also something that has a life of its own. And I think people are more often disaffected by your presence than they are enchanted by it, if they love the work or if they're...
Is that applicable to other vocations from your point of view?
No, because poetry is different from other vocations. Poetry, the power of poetry is that it speaks more directly to the way people feel about their existences, their existence.
Keeping things whole is something that just mesmerizes me, and I wanted to ask you. When you were putting together the anthology, the contemporary. It's called the Contemporary American Poets, right?
Yep.
Yeah. One thing that just struck me not too long ago, what is so beautiful about that, is I would have been angered myself had you not represented yourself in this particular anthology. Mm-hmm. And obviously you chose to do so, but you chose to do so with this single poem. And as I look back at that thing, I say to myself, how remarkable it is given the sense that we have from the poem. In a field, I am the absence of field. In the context of the rest of the poets.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see.
Yes.
Well, I didn't want to be in that book, but the editor made me, and I thought this was, actually, it was my shortest poem, and I thought the one that I was sort of best known for. Mm-hmm. And I think you could read sort of I am the absence of, you could do
yes. The echo is just incredible, I think. And,
don't worry, I'm doing an anthology now of contemporary American poetry, or 20th century American poetry with Jory Graham. There'll be a lot of me in it.
Mm-hmm.
I think. I'm doing her and she's doing me.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. It's easier if other people put you in anthologies.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it doesn't... if you think too much about these things, you go crazy. I know people that sort of count up how many pages they have in an anthology, or forever angry at an anthologist who's left them out for whatever reason. Or
Lucian Strike was getting phone calls left and right when he did Heartland 1 and Heartland 2. People, and these were people that you and I know that have no business behaving like. These are people who have gotten, credit for. For example, there are people that one would not necessarily refer to as Midwestern. Of course, those two anthologies were Midwestern.
Yeah, well, I've actually asked to be left out of an anthology in future because I think it's so bad. And the selection is so bad. That's the Norton anthology. I just think it's more a telephone book than an anthology. I find it degrading to be in there. So many bad poems. It's just, it's horrible.
You think it's because of editing by committee, or?
It's editing by Salesforce. It's not real editing. You know, the salesmen tell you what you put in. I mean, that's why this anthology with Jory Graham will be so good, because we're given freedom to, you know, just pick good poems.
Who's doing it, by the way?
Echo.
Oh, terrific. Of course, Halpern would give one the freedom.
Well, yeah.
Some questions about technical things.
Sure.
So, something that very few people, it seems to me, talk about with regard to your work is diction. You know, they talk about the clarity, of course, and you know, clarity presumably is the ultimate. With I mean, your interest in Elizabeth Bishop seems to me to come from that, your desire for clarity.
Yeah.
We talked about that in Washington, and I remember the look on your face when I said to you, you know, do you not think that you would be a poet in the line of Stevens and Bishop? And you just said that would make me very happy to be considered that way. And
it would.
And it seems to me that the philosophical that comes from Stevens and the desire to communicate, or for the crystal clarity, comes from.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, those are the two people who I consider to be my masters, and I mean, there are other people who have influenced me greatly at different periods of my life, and I've also, you know, of course, those periods of my life have influenced me now. There was a period in which I read and reread the Prelude again and again, and there's a period when I read Robert Frost and sort of dropped Stevens, but I keep coming back to Wallace Stevens, and Elizabeth Bishop was always an influence. And you know, when I never wrote very well in school. I wrote better and better, of course, but when I began as a poet, I wrote rather simple declarative sentences and short lines just to keep track of everything. And it was, for me, the history of my writing has been a gaining of confidence. So now that I can write very long sentences.
That's what the continuous life is, it seems to me.
I mean, one long sentence.
Yes, and it is a manifestation of your control over the situation, but not only stylistically, but the content itself. These problems that you've been dealing with, these great philosophical questions, it seems to me, and I think you have answers for people, but. And I hope that we have an opportunity to get there. But I want to ask you a couple more of these questions about technique, and especially the thing about diction, because I think it'll be very valuable to folks to understand how someone who is as able as you are to get the picture across, how it is you see yourself working with regard to diction. In particular, adjectives and verbs that you choose. And may I give you just one example?
Yeah.
From Leopardi, you had this little thing, something about the stone white moon waits. And it seems to me that the choices that you had available to you are just endless in that regard. And you chose stone white, which to me is miraculous, as well as the word waits. Can you speak to how it is you get your mind to that?
Well, no. I mean, I just don't know. I mean, images come rather automatically. You know, I don't remember. I do tell students that if you sort of think of an adjective and a noun together, the best thing is to sort of separate them, interrogate them, choose one or the other. If it comes automatically, the chances are you've heard it before.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to, think about.
Okay, may I ask then?
Yeah.
Did you sense that particular image, or is your recollection of that one was fairly automatic, stone white?
Could be. It doesn't. For me, I see that you like it. For me, it doesn't strike a chord. I don't remember it as a special thing.
Okay. Could I move to another one then?
Yeah.
I'd like to ask you about it. And this brings up another problem, but you have in Moontan a section that goes like this: the distant, solitary barking of an owl floats toward me. Now that seems to me to be something that one would perhaps have labored over. The barking, for example.
No, the barking, certain owls bark. If you look up in Peterson's guide, the barred owl, his sound is described as a bark.
Mm-hmm. So that was instant for you? I mean, the word barking?
Yeah, I think it was probably one of the initial, I wanted to get an owl barking instead of a dog or something you would associate with another animal because of the... I was a bird watcher then, mm-hmm. And in other poems and Reasons for Moving, I have vireos and thrushes. And
mm-hmm.
Now, the vireo, a thrush, and I can't remember the other bird. They're night migrating birds, and I have them migrating at night in that poem.
Mm-hmm.
But I was very particular about that sort of thing. It's just that it wasn't difficult because the birds and bird sounds were on my mind.
Okay. Well, I see I'm getting myself into a
But I will tell you one thing, about the diction. I always check out the sounds of words. I mean, when you said white, the word waiting and white.
Yes.
And those, and this continuous life even more consciously, self-consciously than previous.
Mm-hmm.
I weigh sounds. For example, my rough drafts of poems are usually in blank verse and very often in rhyme. And the writing of the poem is very much like a Larry Rivers painting, where there's large bits of erasure. I will erase some of the rhymes and keep others, and I will leave some of the lines, in perfect pentameters, and others I will shorten or lengthen. And I justify this by saying this is really free verse, that if you can rhyme and not rhyme in the same poem, that's being free. If you're just not rhyming, then you're caught.
Absolutely.
It's not free.
So you've been doing that since the inception. I
mean,
from the beginning.
Yes. But I have a lot of poems I'm writing now. I'm writing a very long poem, but the other book that I'm writing, just my regular poems, they're mostly in rhyme.
Mm-hmm. Outer Space?
No, Outer Space is not. That's the long thing. But I have another book I've been working on, and a lot of it's in couplets.
Mm-hmm.
I'm writing more ballads. John Hollander and I are going to do a book of ballads called Unlyrical Ballads.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a murder in Utah called the Hi-Fi Murders. I don't know whether somebody here from Utah who may remember. And there was a headline in the paper. One of the murderers is quoted as saying in the headline, "I didn't know Drano could kill." And I thought, what a terrific sort of refrain. If I said, "I didn't know Drano could kill," he said, blah, blah, blah. "I didn't know Drano could kill." But anyhow, sometimes you get things out of the paper like that. But ballads are tremendous fun to write. And I don't know, it's just writing is writing. I can't see people who just want to write poems out of personal experience. I mean, it's no fun after a while.
Yeah, you want to make.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to sort of work your way out of a sestina. Or, when I was a student, I had these two lines that still torture me. I have never been able to write the villanelle that I wanted to write then. The lines are, this is when I was in my, mid-20s. The mind is honest, but the body lies. I am myself. I am my own disguise. And I think, every year it comes up. I'll try to write that sestina. I mean, I must have tried 30 times. It's been 30 years.
It's an incredible idea.
But so far, I'll go to my grave without it.
Well, let me,
that's part of the kick.
Let me ask you, please. How does one? I want to say this a different way. I want to be very direct. How do you, meaning everybody though, but how do you avoid sounding dumb?
Sometimes I sound dumb. I'm sure. I mean, I don't know.
Well,
that's a great fear. Nobody wants to. I think you don't try to write the truth. I mean, you don't try to make big philosophical statements.
But you have.
Well, I don't know it when I'm writing them. I mean, after the fact, you realize that maybe you said something that's pretty good. But, I mean, when you try to say too much or you try to legislate for mankind, that's when you end up sounding dumb.
But in the continuous life, you have done it so indirectly. I mean, for example, in the title poem itself, I mean, what a more noble thing to do than to begin this thing by talking about children and parenthood, and I mean, I can't help but think you are moralizing in the thing, but it's
well, I'm telling kids, listen, give your parents a break.
Yeah.
They're not about to give up. Every kid, I remember fantasies I'd have. I couldn't wait for my parents to get out of the way. I mean, to drop dead so I could have my way. And I'm sure there are times when my son wishes, drop dead, I want to do it my way, So my answer is, I like this life. I'm going to stay here a long time.
Watching watching the grown-ups for signs of surrender as their signs that the irregular pleasures of moving from day to day, of being adrift on the swell of duty, have run their course. Oh, parents, confess to your little ones, the night is a long way off, and your taste for the mundane grows. Tell them your worship of household chores has barely begun. Describe the beauty of shovels and rakes, brooms and mops. Say there will always be cooking and cleaning to do. That one thing leads to another, which leads to another. Explain that you live between two great darks, the first with an ending, the second without one, that the luckiest thing is having been born. And it goes on. It goes on. But, I mean, this just seems
Well, it does get bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yes. But this just seems to me to be, what an incredible piece of advice. I mean,
well, I wanted to be as straight as I possibly could. I mean, brooms and mops and all of that. I've never used them in a poem before, but, I mean, how to take a very banal situation and make it into poetry is rather hard, to take something as ordinary as that.
I have the feeling that much of your reaction to narrative poetry, as we talked about before, has to do with the value that you express here. In that you have seen an opportunity through your work, it seems to me, in the last few years, to get to more important things, and stories cannot necessarily convey those things. Is that reasonable?
Well, I think stories can convey very important things. I wouldn't make it a hard and fast distinction, my objection to the commitment to narrative poetry on the part of some poets is that it's got to be narrative poetry.
Mm-hmm.
It can't be anything else. It's too exclusive. Mm-hmm. And I'm against that kind of exclusivity. I believe that narrative poetry is okay as long as it's not made a religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand.
And I think, but I am...
But you've chosen to move away from it.
It's true, I have. But I can't ever entirely escape it. But I like the notion of revelation or sudden insight. And I do think lyric poetry does. I mean, true lyrics have a certain kind of spatial reality. They unfold. There's a simultaneity about the action in a lyric poem. It's about one thing held back just long enough for you to savor it for one last time. What my feeling about lyric poetry is that it's all elegiac, and that it honors, even the happiest moment is a fleeting moment, and it's lyric poems are memorials to events that have meant something to us. It's a way of honoring life, but it would be impossible without embodying some recognition of death. Young people think of this as a kind of despair. I think it's acknowledgement of death is an affirmation of life. Life doesn't mean anything unless it's going to end.
Absolutely, I understand.
And I think moments don't mean anything unless they're going to end. And the way we talk about this is poetry. Poetry is sort of the way we record the most important things that we experience. And they're all things that come to an end.
Mark, what is a quality life from your point of view? Not necessarily for you personally.
Quality?
A life of quality. Presumably as people who are involved with helping others to move, intellectually and grow spiritually and stuff like that. As teachers, presumably we think about these things.
I'm not sure that being a poet is a life of service. That's a rather selfish life, because you do. Other people read your work, but the pleasure is so intense that one does it for reasons of personal gratification rather than general enlightenment. I think that nurses and doctors and people like that who tend to other people are important, live quality lives, I guess. I really don't know. I don't think in terms of my life, is it a quality life or not? I don't think about it.
How about the fact that you have come to understandings? That you have...
But you see, you're characterizing me as a kind of wise man, which I don't believe I am. I think that I understand some things within the context of my own life, which is quite limited. And I think that the language has led me to write certain things, which makes it appear that I am in possession of a certain amount of wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really the wisdom of the language.
It's
really my fortunate, lucky manipulation at times of the language that comes up with. It makes it appear as if I'm wise. It's actually the language that has demanded that I say these things in some way. I'm its slave, its servant.
You're the toy of language.
Like something. I mean, I'm not very clear on the matter. I can't. One thing I don't do is stand aside and say, I'm doing this or I'm doing that. I just sort of, I'm happy to be doing it, and I don't want to look too deeply into it or to examine my motives or... I just want to do it, and it's like having dinner. I just want to taste it, and I want to taste the wine.
But how lucky people are who want that, though, it seems to me.
Well, I think anybody can, if they can cook, anybody can. It's not hard. I mean, I think writing poetry is much harder than tasting dinner. It's a long, slow process of paying attention. It's actually, in some ways, the result of paying attention.
But see, that it seems to me that you are expressing these values that indicate quality.
Well, maybe. I wouldn't say quality. It's just. My feeling is, and I wouldn't want to legislate this for others. You're here once. You have about 75 years, say. It's the only chance you get. You might as well pay attention. Who wants to be 74 years old with 1 year left saying, gee, what did I do for those 74 years? Or, I only know the names of 2 trees, maple and oak. And I've heard there are 1,000 other trees. Or there's a robin and a sparrow. And I've heard of the ostrich, but
may I quote something from my notes here? How much of the desire for immortality is the desire to know more?
Well, I don't know. I don't believe in immortality because I don't think.
But the desire for it, though.
Well,
isn't that what the monument is all about, in a way?
Yes, it is, but it's a meditation. It's different. It's thinking about immortality in a sort of funny way. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not that I desire it. I don't believe it's possible because one would like to live forever, but is in what Paul Tillich calls one's ontic self, not as a figment of someone else's interest.
Speaking of Tillich, that concept of the ultimate concern that comes out in his work. I have had notes to myself all over the place after the continuous life with Tillich in the margins.
Well, I haven't read him in years. I read him. What is the courage to be?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah, I read that. God, that must have been in the 50s, 60s, a long time ago. I think I was a student when I read it. There's another book that's sort of like that, that's more powerful even, by Miguel de Unamuno, called The Agony of Christianity. And the single greatest meditation on immortality or the idea of transcendence of the self is an essay by Unamuno called The Secret of Life, which is in the agony of Christianity. But, the best you can hope for is that I want my kids to read my work and get a sense of me, because, I don't have a sense of my parents. They didn't write anything. I just have this vague memory of them and events, and I have photographs, but...
Well, is it possible that your parents didn't have the desire that you have to make sure that your children...
Yeah, but that's not immortality, is it?
Oh, no, I don't mean to suggest that. What I'm getting back is to the notion that you own these things that are important to human beings. You own values that are important to human beings. Mm-hmm. And this is an example of it. You look to the future. That's another thing. You use your forebrain. It seems to me like you have always used your forebrain in a way many writers have not. your concern for the ability to be able to handle one's existence is just manifest in your work time and time again.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I care about the future, but I care about the future of the planet. I hope we survive. Whether my feelings about my own work in relation to the future is that my poems are just a sort of little link in a chain of poetry. And, after a while the chain gets so long that nobody's looking at individual links. It's more important that that poetry exists. In some ways I write to keep poetry alive. Not that I might continue into the future, but I believe that poetry is so essentially human that if we lost it, we would be missing something a part of our natures.
Mm-hmm. But and it's not that you feel small, is it?
Well, I feel both small and large.
Yeah. Okay.
I feel empowered and powerless. I feel mortal and immortal. I'm part of a long chain, but I'm also, still just a little thing, a little link. And if people will be reading me 100 years from now, well, that doesn't help me now very much, but it's nice to think that maybe somebody will be reading you that far in the distance, but the chances are quite remote, or in 200 years even more remote. In 500 years, I think next to impossible. When the history of the 20th century is told, maybe one poet will be mentioned in passing.
And it doesn't matter.
No, as long as people 500 years from now are writing poems and sort of having those same sensations of mortality that we have now, and feeling the obligation to savor the moment.
Mm-hmm. May I ask you a couple personal questions now? In April in Washington, I don't know how we got on the topic, but we were talking about marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that as you have grown older, that marriage has become more and more important to you, in that it presumably you are having a better time with marriage. You love being married and your relationship. Is that a function of the person to whom you are married, or is that a function of?
Oh yeah, well, I was very lucky. I had a miserable first marriage, and it wasn't entirely my fault. But marriage is very important. It's very important, I think, to be close to somebody else and to be on intimate terms with another person. I think also, just selfishly, the sort of domestic stability that marriage claims as its character, that certain marriages will claim as their character, is important. Instead of working trying to write in a situation full of turmoil, one works with the expectation of a certain calmness. But my wife reads what I write and tells me what she thinks, and she clearly approves of me. It's very nice to be
tell over the phone.
It's nice to be loved.
I had the fortune of just being able to say thank you to your wife for letting you come. Of course, I was making a joke of it, but
I would have come even if she didn't want me to.
But I just heard in her voice. How strong the bond is. It's really clear.
Well, it's very strong. But, it's not been easy. We've had for those of you in the audience, let me be a marriage counselor. It's never easy. I mean, we've had some terrible ups and downs. It's only in the last 7 years that it's been...
Does that make it stronger? Do the ups and downs make it stronger?
Oh, yeah, because it's just too exhausting. The other way will kill you. Especially at my age. I couldn't survive the emotional turmoil of separation. I mean, up until a few years ago, I looked 25. No, I'm kidding.
Two more questions.
Yeah.
Something that you've been saying to people several times in the last couple of days is most important books you've ever run into. I'd like you to please reiterate.
Well, they're different in different ways. I mean, clearly the Prelude was very important when I was reading it, and I think there's certain individual poems that stand out in my past that were very important when I read them. Reading Elizabeth Bishop and reading Lowell, they were important. Stevens. Recently, rereading in 1985 the Aeneid and the new Robert Fitzgerald translation was extremely important. And then following it up with another book that I think is maybe one of the 5 greatest novels ever written, even though I read it in translation, a novel by Herman Broch called The Death of Virgil. It's fantastic.
Could you explain what you see that novel doing? You explained in a couple of sentences.
Well, it's a novel that's unlike other novels. That is, it's not a narrative in the conventional sense. It resists the move forward. It resists temporality, really. It's Virgil is dying, but it's so the end is known. It's dreamlike and speculative, and it has a large spatial component. The reader doesn't feel as if he's moving ahead so much as spreading out in all directions. So it resists ongoingness. It's very poetic in that sense. I like novels that do the unexpected. I think another important, one of the great novels of the 20th century is Beckett's Malloy, for related reasons, in that it purports to be about nothing, and yet it's so rhetorically rich, it keeps gobbling up experience, and it's really the most reduced form of the Odyssey. I see it. I don't know whether, I never read criticism. I don't know whether anyone else has said this, but when Malloy sets out on this journey to return to his mother, who is not Penelope, but his mother, he fashions out of his bicycle and crutches something that looks like a boat as he crosses the crutches in front of him. And finally he loses the bike and loses the crutches and is crawling on his belly. And one doesn't really know how far he's gotten. It's the shambles of the Odyssey. He's a kind of inverted Ulysses. It's also with absolutely no heroic stature at all. I mean, it's the Odyssey lived in the slime, or carried out in the slime of Ireland. It's also very Irish. There are many things you can say, but the novel also eats up time rather self-consciously. The pebble exchanges pocket to pocket. I don't know if you know that. Pages and pages go by, and it's obsessive and wonderful. And anyway, I don't want to get
one more question.
Yeah.
What do you want to know that you cannot know?
Well, this sounds silly, it's so remote and so silly, and it's such a peculiar wish that I don't wish it very often, and I'm not tortured by it at all. But I would like to know whether the universe is finite or not. Not that, it could be finite on such a scale that it wouldn't make any difference whether it was finite or not. But just that, that would be something to know.
May I say I'm not surprised? Not at all.
The universe is, the sky, for example, we can't imagine, I don't think physicists imagine the size of the universe, the scale of the universe. I think they compute the universe mathematically, which isn't the same thing as imagining it. And one of the wonderful things about imagination, it's so primitive. It's you look up at the sky, it looks rather big, but you have no idea. You can't imagine how big it is. There's no way for us to, because you have to be able to experience something of what you imagine. There's no way to experience that scale. It exists numerically. It exists symbolically.
Are you trying to experience it with outer space at all? The long poem?
Well, no, there's no way for me to. I'm just a little guy, the universe is tremendous. I can't.
But you do have a sense, do you not, sometimes that by looking at the particulars, you can at least get a glimpse of the cosmos?
Well, I guess, yeah. If you look hard, you see that it's kind of. In many ways, it's not only the spatially, but the sort of the one context in another context, the contextuality of everything, and it's infinite. But you can drive yourself nuts, I don't know. My long poem that I'm writing called Outer Space, it's called Outer Space, or a poem of our limitations. It's just that as American poets today have so written about themselves that they've crowded out space. They've become their own myths. It becomes, an egotistical sublime on the scale that Wordsworth could never have dreamt. I don't know, there should be more modesty. I think poets should be more modest.
Thank you.
Thank you.